Welcome to this session about studying abroad when it's raining frogs or in other uncertain times. In this session, we're going to talk a little bit about studying abroad during uncertain times right now. And we're going to hear from both an on-campus and home institution perspective, program provider perspective, and we will also have the opportunity to hear from a student. If you'd like, please ask your questions in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to respond as soon as we can. This session is recorded, and we will be able to make it available to people after the event within the next couple days. We'll be sure to email you when that's available so you can refer back to it. Without further ado, I will pass it on to our next panelist.
Hi everybody, welcome to our very first ever virtual study abroad fair and our very first ever 7 college study abroad fair. And as Lisa mentioned, our title is Study Abroad When It's Raining Frogs. Our working title was actually Study Abroad During a Pandemic. Our student panelists said, well, that's not very appealing. So we changed the name, and maybe studying abroad when it's raining frogs is not very appealing either. But if you are here today, you're probably thinking about studying abroad sometime in the next year or so. And it's really clear to those of us who work in study abroad that study abroad in the future, in the foreseeable future, is not going to look like it did even as in fall 2019 for some time to come. That said, study abroad now, I think, is more important than ever. There's so much that we can learn from our fellow humans, and so much to be gained by working together. So the panelists and I will be sharing our perspective on some lessons learned over the past months and thoughts about how we're going to move forward. So who are we? My name is Jennifer Thomas Stark. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm the Director of International Study at Wellesley College. As an undergraduate, I studied abroad on my college's study abroad program in Oxford, England. And then after I was in grad school, I moved to France and worked for 4 years in France, running the Boston College study abroad programs in Strasbourg, France. And then I lived in London for a few years, and then I've been at Wellesley in this role for the past 16 years. And I have to say, I've never had such a traumatic experience with professionally as in the past spring when we worked really quickly to bring students home from all over the world as borders were closing and international flights were hard to come by. I'm joined by a Wellesley College senior who was one of those students who was abroad last spring, and as well as 2 colleagues who are experts in health and safety for large study abroad programs. I'll let Morgan, Vanessa, and Stacy, I'll let you introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Morgan. I'm a senior at Wellesley right now. I'm studying econ and math, and I was abroad almost the full year at Yale and US College in Singapore. And I just want to thank Jennifer and all of the OIS staff for getting everyone home in the spring. And also, your efforts are very commendable for dealing with some of the more uncooperative students, of which I was one. But I'll get into that later.
Hi everyone, my name is Stacy Santier and I'm the Director of Health and Safety for DIS, which is a Scandinavian study abroad program. We send students to Denmark and Sweden. And I'll tell you a little bit more about DIS when we get to my section. But I'll let you know that I first traveled abroad when I was in high school. I lived in Belgium. Then in college, I went to Australia for a semester. And then after graduating, I spent 2 years in Japan. So my international experience is sort of all over the board. And I've been here working in education abroad basically since I returned from Japan, so my whole career. Vanessa?
Hi, I'm Vanessa Sterling, and I'm similar to Stacy. I work for a provider. I work for CET academic programs. We have programs in 10 different countries. And I started out on my study abroad journey as a college junior and I studied in Beijing, and I was one of the first group of students who went back to Beijing after the Tiananmen Square uprising. So I have a little bit of understanding of what it means to be entering into uncharted territory. After undergrad, I went to grad school, and I ended up living in China and working for a little over 3 years. And like Stacy, after I came back to the US, I decided to transition, and I've worked in study abroad in a variety of ways for about 15 years. And like Stacy now, my full purview is health and safety for students who go abroad.
Great, thank you so much. And that's, as you're all aware, this is a 7-college program, so we have, we're really excited to have students from multiple colleges in the audience and at the fair. So one thing you'll notice as you participate in the various sessions today or meet with the exhibitors, you're going to realize that each of our 7 institutions might have a really different approach and timeline and criteria for allowing study abroad. Some schools are allowing some limited study abroad right now. Some have canceled study abroad for fall and spring already. Some have not yet made decisions for spring. You know, in some colleges you'll see will have very defined criteria, such as it's not possible to study abroad if there's a State Department level 3 or level 4 warning, or a CDC level 3 warning. And others look at a very different set of criteria. So at Wellesley, for instance, we have a formal international safety committee, and it's made up of our provost, our dean of students, director of health services, our chief of police, our risk manager, director of international programs, director of experiential learning, and the faculty chair of our international study committee. This is a team that meets regularly to determine under what conditions students may study abroad or pursue college-sponsored internships. Your college may or may not have some similar formal committee, but regardless, this will give you an idea of the scope of stakeholders there are at any institution that your study abroad officer is working with to make decisions around whether or not international travel is permitted. And beyond generally determining if students can study abroad or travel internationally, there's the issue of where and under what circumstances. And there we really lean largely on our study abroad partners to help us understand the situation as it is on the ground and what measures are in place to mitigate the risks. So if your college has welcomed students back to campus for the fall in the US, you'll be aware of the complex endeavor that this has been and the long list of safety measures that are in place to mitigate those risks. Before we send students abroad, we need to be sure that there are equivalent or similar measures in place for our students. They're adapted, of course, for local conditions. And luckily, there are experts like Stacy and Vanessa who do the heavy lifting and think about this sort of thing all the time. Because we are small colleges with limited human resources, we really also depend a lot on our students to do their own research. And we're really lucky to work with students very smart students from our institutions who are capable of doing good research. Students really need to do the work to understand what the risks are in their study abroad location, what safety measures are in place to mitigate the risk, and how these might impact their on-site experience. And also what resources are available if things go awry. So speaking of very smart students who are capable of researching, that's my segue over to Morgan to talk a little bit about her experience in Singapore.
Yep, and just before I get into that, there was just a question in the Q&A, and I wasn't sure if we're going to be answering those live or not. I believe that we're going to be answering them in real time, correct?
So I think we'll try to answer those at the end.
Okay. Okay. All right. So I'm Morgan again. I know I already introduced myself, but I'm studying econ math. I'm a senior this year. Currently, so right now I'm at home in New Hampshire, where I have been since early April, which is when I came home from Singapore. And first off, I just want to get into some of my motivations for study abroad, because I hope that, as well as being a cautionary tale, if you will, but maybe not quite a cautionary tale, but at least something that you can gain your own perspective from. I want this also to be a little bit about Yale and US and studying abroad in Singapore, because it was one of the best years of my life. And I hope that it's something that people listening right now can consider going to. So some of my motivations for study abroad were, well, number one, I always knew that I wanted to be abroad for a full year. Everyone that I ever talked to who had been abroad anywhere had always said, oh, they're so glad that they studied for a full year, or, oh, I wish I'd studied for a full year. And so that was always my plan. I chose Singapore specifically because, well, number one, Yale and US College really lined up with what I was looking for at the time. Number two, because I spent some time there in 2018. I lived there for a couple months. And I wanted to, so since I knew or thought that I would be staying somewhere for the full academic year, I wanted to be someplace that I was already pretty comfortable with, and Singapore was one of those places. And as well as the setup of YNC, it's a liberal arts college, similar, academically pretty similar to Wellesley. It's actually even smaller, and it's also a young school. So this was one of the things that I didn't think twice about before going, but might be something that you want to consider when thinking about where you want to study abroad, is how old is the school, which sounds weird, but Yale and US is not even, I don't think it's even 10 years old. And if it is, then it's just barely over that. But one of the things that you noticed just by talking to roommates and classmates was that things are constantly happening around you, and the school is still building itself and will be for years to come. Students have a huge say in how different, how different sections of the administration are built or run. Students have a say in academic policies that they might not have a say in at an older or more established institution. And part of that is because it's also such a small school. So I think it's under 1,000 students, which is even smaller than Wellesley. And I was looking for something like that. So it might not be what you're looking for, but if you're looking for a really intense liberal arts experience, a super close-knit community, that's definitely Yale and US. Everybody knows everyone. It's like a small town for the most part. It's also a great network. So about 50% of students are international. I think it's around that. And a lot of the professors are international as well. And I was stopped multiple times by people who I only knew through Facebook saying, oh my gosh, I know someone who goes to Wellesley. And even coming back for December, I went to Wellesley for one day, and someone who, again, I only knew over Facebook from Wellesley said, oh my gosh, you're going to Yale and US. Like, I know someone there. So it's interesting how small of a world it is, for sure. They have unique classes. So one of the other reasons that I wanted to go to Yale and US specifically was that they have a really, really good urban studies department, which is something that I couldn't get that much of staying at Wellesley. And so that was an area that I was able to expand on and see if I liked. And actually, through that, through those classes that I took, and this spring I took no classes in my major, which I would highly recommend. Just, focus on something besides what you're graduating in just for a little bit, because that actually helped me to decide what within economics I like. So I took an urban ecology course that got me really interested in environmental science, and I'm thinking about environmental economics. Taking classes outside of your comfort zone will definitely lead to interesting revelations. So that's something I also recommend if you're looking for a broader experience. And location-wise, Yale NUS is in a pretty quiet neighborhood of Singapore. It's almost suburban, and it's next to NUS's main campus, so it's like a parent university of Yale NUS. And that's where we go to get groceries and to go to the convenience store to eat food when we don't like the dining hall. So that's the gist of Yale NUS. Okay, next slide. Okay, photo dump. So I took all of these, and again, this is more tips for studying abroad, and again, this is pre-pandemic, so this is kind of what it was like and what I think we all hope that it can be like again in the future. Whether or not it's like this again in the future, we don't really know. But you'll see later on in the presentation that I think I got even more out of being there for the second semester than I did in the first. So general tips for studying abroad, get to know the local area. Oh wait, here, I gotta explain the photos. So general tips are getting to know the local area. The top left and the top right photos are from Singapore. That's Keppel Bay with a bunch of fancy boats in the Art Science Museum. Top middle photo is from Indonesia, where I went on our fall break. And the bottom three are from a trip with the basketball team, which I joined at Yale NUS to Shanghai. And that was probably one of the smartest decisions that I made while I was studying abroad, was to join some sort of extracurricular organization or activity. And for me, that was basketball, and that opened up a lot of doors that I wouldn't have been able to go through if I hadn't joined in the first place. Because I think no matter where you go, there's going to be some sort of exchange bubble, and it's harder to break out of that in some places than it is in others. And at Yale NUS, it is pretty hard to break out of that because there's a lot of exchange students, a lot. And one of the ways you can get out of the exchange bubble is by joining like a sports team, for example. I have friends who joined a debate team, some activist organizations, and made the same sort of connections. Okay, now you can go on. Okay, so between first semester and second semester, I came home for about a month or so. I went back a couple weeks early with one of my friends. I traveled around. We went to Japan, Vietnam, Cambodia, and I got back to Singapore on January 13th, which is an important date for a little bit later. So by late January, that was when everyone on campus and everyone in Singapore was realizing that COVID was going to become an issue. It's not that we hadn't heard about what was happening before then, but by the end of January, cases were going up much more than they had been in the middle of January, especially with Chinese New Year. Singapore wasn't stopping or canceling flights until February for the most part. And so cases started increasing around then. But it was never, it was never so serious that we were really concerned on campus until probably late February or March. And February was when we started, when households were given masks. It was when they were distributed to universities. And this is also when twice daily temperature declarations were required. You weren't even allowed to go to class or attend class if the teacher had seen that you hadn't put in your temperature declaration. And the picture on the bottom is of one of the hawker centers in Singapore. And this was part of the social distancing measures. So every other seat was taped off so that you could only sit diagonally from people. And we saw that in public. Actually, I think we saw that in our school before we saw it happening in public. And the top right picture is from Malacca in Malaysia. And I went there in February, and the point of saying that is that if you are in a place that is experiencing some sort of disruption, so that was COVID in Singapore, things had started to shut down, it might not be as bad in another place that's nearby. There were very, very few cases in Malaysia at the time that I went. And so I don't know if you can see in that picture, but no one is really wearing masks. It wasn't even thought of at that time because there were only a few cases. And so that's again something that you should consider when traveling abroad. Is there a place nearby that you can go if there happens to be some sort of unrest, whether it be serious or not, or whether it puts you in danger or not. Though I don't want to make it sound so like serious and scary like that, but it's just good to know what's around your area. And so for us, that was Malaysia for a while. A lot of people had planned trips to Japan and Taiwan that got canceled because of the increase in cases. Okay, and go to the next slide. Okay, so one of the other things that was happening around Singapore was that some of the hawker centers were, well, since they were limiting seating, some restaurants were closing down, and a couple of the dining areas on NUS's main campus were also closing down. And that was a very big deal for the students at YNC because although I said a lot of great things about it in the beginning, they didn't have the best dining halls. So we went to NUS quite a lot to eat out. And so once those places started closing down, I became a master at the grilled cheese. So yes, that's a picture of one of my grilled cheese sandwiches that I perfected once all of the NUS food halls shut down. And that's a quote that I've heard from probably dozens of people since this whole crisis started. And that quote equated to my mastering the grilled cheese sandwich. Okay, go on. And so this was March into April, and only early on in April. One of my friends and I, whether or not this was irresponsible, I'm still thinking and considering it, but one of my friends and I took advantage of the reduced crowds in Singapore to go to a bunch of museums. Neither of us contracted anything. We were totally fine, but this is the Asian Civilizations Museum towards the top, and it's one of the most popular museums in Singapore. We went on a Saturday afternoon, and there's no one there. Absolutely no one. It got really eerie in March and towards April. And I think that affected the whole experience as well. And in the picture on the left, you can sort of see, you can sort of see, but some of those chairs are saran wrapped. So that's what they did in our dining halls to say, don't sit in this chair, you have to social distance. And by March, a lot of the extracurricular activities had been canceled or limited. our classes were starting to become socially distanced as well. We had to move to bigger lecture theaters. Everyone was feeling by March, everybody at Yale NUS and NUS was feeling the pressures that COVID was putting on us. And it was stressful. And I will say that if you go abroad in fall, I don't think it's going to be as stressful, because this was such a period of transition that I hesitate in calling it the new normal, because, oh, okay, I will get to my point. But it wasn't, but it was a period of transition. It wasn't normal, and I don't think this will be normal. But we also had a mock graduation ceremony for our senior roommates. So I returned the 7th to home from tropical Singapore to early April in New Hampshire, which was very cold. Next slide. And that was it. And I went back and the airports were empty. And so was, there's like so few people by the Merlion there. You can just see how empty everything was. And I was asked by Jennifer earlier, if I did it again, would I leave sooner? And I really did stall in leaving here. I got so many communications from Wellesley, from Yale NUS, from the embassies that were like, you should leave. And I was like, but should I? Because I didn't want to leave. And I think I really dragged my feet, and I think it would have been more responsible to leave earlier, but in the end, it worked out, and I'm lucky. But I would also advise you to listen to your schools and institutions and embassies. So, okay, I'm done.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit, Stacy and I will talk a little bit about the provider perspective. First of all, it's important to know what is a provider. Sometimes people do a direct exchange like Morgan did with Yale NUS. Sometimes people go through faculty-led, something that's led by, one of your normal on faculty. But then a lot of people will work with a provider, and that's an organization like CET, like DIS, many other acronyms, that works together with multiple U.S. institutions and host universities, and we create and deliver academic programs abroad. Varying degrees of staff size and staff support. Usually everybody is bilingual and is there to make your transition to that country and that host institution as smooth as possible, and then to support you if there are issues, COVID, anything else like that, and to make your experience really well-rounded.
And just to add to that, I think it's important for you guys to understand that providers and schools don't exist in a vacuum. And so this is a very collaborative relationship. And so if you see a provider on an approved list at your university, it means some of these processes and communication and protocols have been reviewed by your campus, as Jennifer had referenced earlier. And to know that COVID isn't the first time we've thought of this thing. This isn't our first rodeo. There have been, as Vanessa's example, when she studied abroad illustrated, there have been these types of things that we've been planning for, thinking about for a very long time. And the sort of health and safety world in education abroad has only gotten more and more professionalized over recent years. And for example, when I studied abroad and when Vanessa studied abroad, this was one of many hats that people in an education abroad office held. But increasingly, we're seeing more and more people at US institutions and at providers who do health and safety work full time. So that doesn't mean that if you're going on a program that doesn't have a full-time health and safety person, that somehow they're deficient, because those study abroad officers and advisors are also working with those of us who do this full time. And so we're all sort of having these types of conversations across the board.
Yep. So basically what we decided was to talk about from our perspective, and less from our respective organizations, but from as people who work with health and safety with providers, to really help you to start thinking about what are the questions and the things you could be concerned about when you're just exploring your options. I would say the number one thing is to bring your flexibility, recognizing that study abroad may not look like what Morgan talked about, or if you have older siblings or classmates, the experience will likely be different. So for example, if you think that you're going to go to Spain so you can go all over Europe through a semester, that likely will be different. You may have to stay more in one location, or at least in one country. You'll probably have to respond more quickly to your provider, and may have to move. But that does not mean it won't be enriching, very fulfilling, and a whole lot of fun. It just may look different. And so if you're willing to go into this, also understanding that initially what you're signing up for may change in the middle, kind of like what Morgan was saying, based on what might happen, COVID or otherwise, then you're going to really get more out of it, as opposed to going into with a very fixed idea of, 5 or 6 things on your study abroad bucket list.
And I would just say that one of the things that we talked about in preparing for this session was the importance related to flexibility on travel. And I think a lot of you might be coming into today's meetings and discussions with programs with the idea that you are going to pick one location and use that sort of as your jumping off point to travel in a region. And that used to be really how this worked. And we don't have a magic 8 ball, so we don't know exactly, sort of looking glass into the future, what things will look like. But we all have a sense that travel will be a little bit more limited even a year from now. And so to really reset that expectation, and instead of being bummed about not being able to travel, to really try to think about it as a really great opportunity to get to know the location that you're in. And as Morgan's story illustrated, being able to spend more time looking at museums, getting to know your friends, going out with the clubs you join, and really staying local, it's such a great opportunity that's often missed by those students who do jump around. And know that you'll have a chance to do that again. We won't stay in this limited travel place forever in anyone's estimation. And so be flexible. And then that also, I think, dovetails with the next point that we have here, which is the collective responsibility. So also, as Jennifer's points highlighted at the beginning, this isn't a situation where you choose a program and then hope that your university or that your provider will take care of it all for you, right? We really do need to make sure that we're having conversations with you, that you understand the limits of what we can do, and that you understand the pieces of what you need to take responsibility for. One example that I've shared, we do have students abroad this fall, including soon from Wellesley. And we are, for example, cleaning some of our buildings more often, doing more sanitation, marking spaces for flow charts and things like that. And I know this is very similar to what CET and other programs are doing as well. But we're not just doing it all for students, right? We also have to teach the students about how to sanitize their desks and their chairs after each use and before they sit down, how to clean their private spaces in their housing. So just making sure to really look at this as a collaborative endeavor between you, your program, and your study abroad office.
So basically what we're both going to recommend at this point is, so our organizations have very clear protocols, and it's things that we're including in pre-departure and then on-site orientation and then through the term. If you're considering going to a provider or an exchange partner or doing something through your college or university, you really should be an informed consumer of this and really ask a lot of questions. Don't just read their website, but if you have a chance to speak to their rep, either through this forum or through emailing and then setting up a conversation, ask those questions. The other question I would certainly ask that I know is something that we at CET, and I know DIS did this as well, is how did they do through the essential stress test that was spring of 2020? Most specifically, were they able to get people out before they, before the doors closed, before the borders literally closed? That's a question. And another really important question is, what kind of academic continuity were they able to offer students? I know it's the case for DIS, also CET, and many other providers, but not all, that everyone was able to finish their coursework remotely and get a full semester's worth of credit. Now, obviously, that's not the same experience as being abroad, but at least people were able to stay on target and complete their coursework and get their tuition dollars worth. So really start asking those programs and advocating for yourself. And if you don't get direct answers, that may give you the answer that in fact they don't have a plan. I could say that it's hard also to say which particular destination will be better than the other. And most important at this point then would be to pick the destination that fits what your academic motivation is for going. And so if you really go into it with that sort of mentality, I think you'll make a good choice. You'll have a great, wonderful experience. And again, like Stacy said, you have a chance to really be more grounded in the place that you are. Final thing I would say is this is not the last time you're going to travel in your life. This is probably the first or maybe second of many opportunities. So recognize that if you don't make it to Paris, the Eiffel Tower is still there. It's not going to go anywhere. So instead, really focus on what you can accomplish in that time and be flexible.
Yeah, and I would just add to all the great things that Vanessa just shared. I think you've got some questions from this event that will help you approach these conversations, guiding principles of questions you can ask as you start to explore these things. But also think about what matters to you. What's your biggest value? What's your biggest goal? And how do they respond? And I think to Vanessa's point, it's very important that people can give you an answer that you feel comfortable with, but also know, to this collective responsibility point as well, that things are constantly changing. And so anyone who tells you that 2 years from now something will be a certain way, they don't actually know, just like you don't know, right? And so I think being flexible and taking some responsibility to really probe people when they say, yeah, we'll have that covered. Ask them for examples, ask them for what that means, and also be willing to hear they don't know, or they can't tell you yet, but they'd be happy to get back to you later. So I think with that, we will hand it back over to Jennifer for a couple wrap-up words before we go into question and answer.
Sure. I know we're running kind of low on time, but I would love to show this short video because it's an example of how programs have pivoted, and it'll make kind of the idea of not traveling all around Europe. It'll help you understand how programs have pivoted and that it doesn't seem that bad after all. Oh, are we gonna, can you click that? Do we have sound? Well, maybe we skip this because we don't have sound on it, Lisa. Can we?
What'd you say?
I don't think there's sound on that.
Oh, I was hearing the sound.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't.
Changed because of the health crisis of the past months? Yes, it has. The goals are the same, but two things are different. First, the topics that are seen in the Preshko classes will be more about local discovery and exploration that will serve as a basis for global understanding. Second, co-curricular cultural and community aspects of the program take on new significance as well. Rather than experiencing culture spread out over Spain, students will experience a deeper culture by staying closer to home. Time spent with people in the homestay and neighborhood, visits within the city of Córdoba, excursions to nearby villages and nature areas in the province of Córdoba, and slightly longer trips all within a similar geographical context, lends a coherence that explains how people lived in Córdoba and Andalusia, and how their history shapes how they respond to challenges in today's world. So what has changed, and what will continue to change? Preshko, through its close relationship with the University of Córdoba, allows students to combine topics in humanities and sciences because a pandemic such as the one that we are experiencing needs both areas and needs them to share information in order for us to respond quickly and intelligently to crises. Living and studying in Córdoba means living in a city with a population of more than 300,000, a university with 17,000 students, and more UNESCO World Heritage sites than any other city in the world. Preshko's out-of-class visits will take you to places where you can see why the topography, the geography, and the bodies of water contributed to what Córdoba is like today. You'll also see excavation sites that reveal the levels of cultural history that are part of people's heritage and identity in Córdoba. The streets are reminiscent of tangible and intangible culture, literature, philosophy, music, dance, art, architecture, language, religion, food, and so much more. If we have learned anything from these past months, it is the importance of community. We all have a heightened sense of who we are and with whom we come into contact. Preshko makes an intense effort to facilitate the process of meeting local people through homestays, activities with the University of Córdoba students, and beyond. This has always been a strong point at Preshko. It is now even stronger because you will be spending more time with families and friends and working even closer with them, learning by observing how people relate to each other as a community. Your neighborhood will become your source of information, and you will see how such things as health services, religious practices, education, nutrition, and sustainability work in Spain, and especially in Córdoba.
So on that note, I just want to just a couple of things, and these are things that Stacy and Vanessa said. So I'm not going to insist, but it's really important. We've been talking about COVID a lot, but it's important to prepare for the full range of emergency situations. We had before COVID, there were strikes and civil unrest that really wreaked havoc in some locations. So you need to look kind of more broadly. You need to identify the resources available before emergencies happen. And just know that most emergency situations are preventable or manageable, navigable with some good preparation and some common sense. So it's possible to have a really fabulous study abroad experience and a safe one, even when it is raining frogs. So we will just open it up to a couple of questions that we have. And I know that, again, we're running over, so you'll need to rush out to see the exhibitors soon. But I think we have, I see a couple of questions. So the first question I see is, what situation would cause students to be sent home? Is it the level of the country, the number of cases? Is it up to the student to decide if they go home or not? And the answer to that is, well, it depends on your institution for the most part. Everyone has a different criteria, different decision-making process. In the spring, it was mainly driven because borders were closing, but in the next round, I think it's unlikely the borders will close so quickly, and there will be other criteria in place. And then maybe this is for Morgan. Do you have tips for learning about the community or culture before you go?
So reading this, I'm assuming it's talking not about the specific place that you're going to go, but like the school that you're going to go to. Honestly, but in either case, I would say like my automatic answer for that is talk to someone who's done that program before. And I'd also like to say that it's definitely not going to be, I could think of if someone went to Yale and US, they would have a wholly different experience than if someone went to NUS. because it's a much larger university. And in my case specifically, I was the first person from Wellesley to go to Yale NUS for abroad. So I didn't really have anyone from Wellesley at least to talk to about what I should be expecting. So I would also say that it's okay to go into something with not every piece of information you could possibly find in the world on this program. I think a little bit of mystery, a little bit of unexpectedness can be a good thing.
I just wanted to add something to the previous statement too about pulling people back. I think that one of the things that we should remember, at least about last spring, was it's a novel coronavirus, meaning we really didn't know very much about how it was transmitted, about treatment for it, about the ability for someone to recover from it. All of these things were very unclear, and the very first experiences we had of this both in China and then in Italy were very bleak. So I think that was why we were much more, as a field and as a world, really trying to get back to home, wherever home was. And so I think that kind of advanced the timeline. I don't necessarily think that even if you were studying abroad in spring of 2021, that if there were a spike in your location, I don't think that universities and colleges would necessarily respond in the same way. I think that what you might be asked to do would be to quarantine or shelter in place, something like that, or to, you know, curtail your travels and just stay in one city. But I think that it's important to know that what we did in evacuating the world, at least in my, you know, almost 20 years of experiences, never happened before. So I don't think that it's something you have to necessarily be concerned about, you know, immediately something bad happens and you gotta leave. That's really rare.
So I would just say if you have questions, since some of this is very school specific, I would suggest that you reach out to your study abroad office if you've got questions about the policies that impact whether or not you can study abroad and when and where and under what circumstances you might be home. But now is a great opportunity for you to go around to all of the exhibitors that are at the exhibit hall and you know, ask each one of them a question that your parent might like to know the answer to, in addition to the things that you're really interested in. One more last question. For the upcoming spring, if study abroad occurs, what is the best way to research safe countries, pandemic-wise, to go to? Is there anything to consider before looking at the current number of COVID-19 cases? I defer to Stacy and Vanessa on that.
It's a really easy answer. No, it's a great question because it is challenging. I think the important thing, and maybe what the person asking this question is trying to get at, is that it is beyond just the number of cases, right? So it's important to look at the number of cases, but also to do that in context. And so every time I see just case numbers, you know, the question is always, oh, what's the population there? What percentage of people are getting tested? What percentage of the tests are therefore coming back as positive? And then when you sort of put the numbers aside, which may look falsely inflated or falsely deflated, depending on sort of variables and political discussions, then also thinking about other factors. How strong is the healthcare system in the location? How stable is society generally? How supportive is your program? Lots of pieces that would not just be about COVID, but would be about sort of the broader context of time abroad. Vanessa, can you add to my list? I know the list keeps going and going.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing is what kind of medical insurance do you have, either your program, what kind of stipulations are there for care? Again, looking back at the experience of the spring, I mean, I would say right now, of the places where we offer programs, CET, we have them in Europe, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East. The two places that I would pick would probably not be the places you would immediately pick. I would think Jordan would be the best, one of the safest, because of the way that Jordan closed their borders, and Taiwan. Taiwan for sure, because it's an island that has handled it greatly. Those would not necessarily be either A, places you would want to go, or places that would be to the top of your list if you were looking to study Arabic or Mandarin. So I think that looking back at their experience, but absolutely, I couldn't agree more with Stacy. How robust is their medical system, and can you have the support on the ground if something happens? But to say that today Spain is one way, so I'll go to Costa Rica, it's kind of like chasing the wind. You just don't really know at this point.
And I think I would just add that, of course, this also has to do with your own comfort level. And I think you're used to now navigating this over the last 6 months or more in your daily life. So how comfortable are you with changing policies and procedures? How comfortable are you right now being in social settings? What are the case numbers in the state or the city that you live in, and how does that impact you? How does that make you feel? So really not only looking outward at those places, and of course, as Vanessa highlighted, focusing on the things that have little chance to change, like the academic strength of the place or the language immersion of the place. But then also really just doing a gut check. What do you want out of this experience? How comfortable are you? Sort of how have you experienced the last 6 months, and how might that translate to different settings?
Well, thanks everybody. I think that's a good way to wrap up. And again, if students have questions, hopefully you know how to reach your study abroad office. And thanks so much to Stacy and Vanessa and Morgan for spending the afternoon with us.
Good luck.